Hey, very much appreciate it. I, um, Let me just tell you a little bit about Potomac Valley Fly Fishers, just so you know. We have about 155 members and their families, and we've had a lot of growth this last year, as I'm sure you'll hear from other people who deal with the outdoors. We're very much committed, not just to fishing, only fishing, but also education, conservation, and the environment. And in fact, when you mentioned doing the Monocacy cleanup, we participate in many cleanups throughout the Frederick County area, and I am sure that we will send your notice of the cleanup out to our memberships. I'm sure you get volunteers, and I know every year we're on the bottom end of the Monocacy, and we do a kayaking fishing trip in June, led by one of our members, Karen Baker. So it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you all. It's something we all agree with, and hopefully you'll learn a little something here. And I'm going to throw out some ideas. I've had some very good discussions with Tim. He's been great just to try to figure out what we can do with this and some options. So I'm going to lay it out and let's see where we go with that. So if we can go to the first slide there, Tim.
Okay.
So what we're trying to come up with is a way to recognize Lefty, who was born and raised in Frederick, on the Monocacy. And as I go through his history, you can see why the Monocacy is a very good choice for something. So if we can go to the next one. So here's Lefty, who passed away 2 years ago. Whoa, just about a week ago, 2 years ago. And if you're a fisher or hunter living anywhere in the world, you will have probably heard of Lefty. I remember I was down in South Carolina on a little charter fishing boat, and this one congressman was talking to the captain, and both of them were talking about Lefty, and I'm thinking, whoa, I'm in South Carolina. What is this? So, he's very famous for those who are into fishing. There are a lot of people who've never heard of him because they're not into fishing. That's all right. But we think, if you think about it, being able to sort of come up with something to commemorate him would be a great way to raise Frederick County, our profile, and as an outdoor destination and worldwide. And you'll see there's some other things that this builds on as well. So this is our history lesson. If you can go to the first chapter. I found this you like this picture? I found this very interesting. Just studying his autobiography and some of these people. He's born in 1926, and he graduated from Frederick High School, not in 2018, but recognized in 2018 as a Frederick High School distinguished alumni. And I'll tell you, I attended that swearing in, and Don Fine, who's one of our members, did a beautiful job. And the other people who were receiving that award were sitting there spellbound by what Don was saying. So even them, it was so impressive. To me, the critical factor is, as you can see, his father died when he was 7, and he was the oldest of 4 kids. So it was like 7, 6, 4, and a few months. And they had lived a comfortable lifestyle, but being a widow, his mother had to move. They lived on North Bend Street, which back then was considered, not the good part of town. And his family had to live on assistance. But a lot of that hard scrabble beginning got him out there hunting and fishing to really support his family. He was catching food for his family, but he was also catching the food, and he would sell the fish to local fish market and make some money. He would catch catfish, or he would trap muskrat and other things and be able to sell that. And that way he was able to supplement his mother's income. So it really, I guess, infected him with the hunting and fishing and part of life. So I move on to his middle life here, Tim. He enlisted in the war after high school. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge. And then after he came back, he got a job at Fort Detrick. And I'm not sure what his shift to work, what time it was, but it gave him plenty of time for fishing and hunting again. So he worked for many years at Fort Detrick and supplemented his fishing. So we move to our last piece here. These humble beginnings, sort of got him as a career as an outdoor writer with Frederick News Post, and I'm sure you've seen periodically. I know Sue prints reprints of his articles, which was he was a great writer. He was one of the founders of our organization 53 years ago. There was four of them, and Lefty was one of them who started with us. He's member of 3 Hall of Fames, and he's fished with all these famous people here. I tried to pick a wide assortment, not to discriminate against anyone or play up anyone, but just to show he was out there fishing with people, and everybody knew. So the next slide, sort of just as an introduction, I did a little research as to where there's been other public recognition of what I call inspirational fishers. So I got a couple of examples just to show you. I guess the idea is to sort of just stir the imagination to see what we can do. So, when we first came up with this idea, we wanted we wanted to rename the Monocacy Scenic River Trail to the Lefty Cray something trail. And Tim says, no, we can't do a whole, park. There's county regulations. And I actually respect that, do that. I have this was at the Gunpowder, and they did not name the entire Gunpowder Falls. They had like an offshoot trail that they named the Lefty Cray Fishing Trail. And you'll see in the next picture where not only do they have this trail, but they had a little rock with a monument. And this is then Governor O'Malley did that. And I was trying to do some reconnaissance work because, as I have learned, every great idea ultimately degenerates into hard work. So I was thinking, okay, if we come up with this idea, who are we going to have to talk to? And from what I understand, this whole proposal, I can't tell you if it costs money or how much, but they had to run it through the Department of National Resources. They approved it. The Board of Public Utilities eventually at the end had to vote on this. So I just throw that out there as some research that I've done. Okay, next slide. We have a couple of things up in Hunting Creek that named after famous fly fishermen from the area. There's a Frank Benz Pond, which is right off 77 there, that you're all familiar with. I know they've been doing some work on the waterfall, so you got that. If we go to the next one, you got the Bill Burton Fishing Pier. This is on the Chop Tank. Bill Burton was a outdoor writer as well, and he was actually instrumental in helping to preserve this little area as a state park. Next slide. I'm not going to give you a history of every person. This guy, Joe Brooks, again, there's a monument at Big Hunting Creek. Joe was the guy who taught Lefty. So Joe's the one who got Lefty into all this stuff. And he was also a writer of the Frederick News Post. So I guess he sort of passed it on. So Joe Brooks is he's got an interesting story himself, but he's the guy who got Lefty more into it. Okay, next one. This is Pennsylvania did something recognizing Vince Marinaro, who was the name of my math teacher in high school, but this is not him. And Charlie Fox, again, 2 famous Pennsylvania fishermen. And one of the reasons I want to show this in the prior picture, you can see fly fishermen love this stuff. They come and they pose with these guys because, to them, these are icons and part of the history of, getting into that. So I just wanted to do that. Okay, next slide. Even the post office recognized his contribution. He created a fly. It's called the Lefty's Deceiver, and this is one of the top flies to use in saltwater fishing. So he developed this and mimics, a minnow and all that, but it's world famous. So it's pretty interesting. So when the post office can recognize one of your local people, I think we should do something in Frederick County. So the next slide, please. I talked a little bit about the economic impact, and I got these numbers from the DNR that gave a presentation. And actually, this is 2018 numbers. So in 2018, they calculated 53,000 anglers fish for trout with an estimated annual expenditure of 56 million. And of course, there's a lot of fishing on the bay. This is just trout fishing. And by my humble calculations, it's about $1,000 per angler. So the economic impact, the more people you get coming in to go fishing in Frederick County, the more economic impact it's going to be. And for those who aren't into fly fishing, Frederick County's got some wonderful places to go fishing. And I won't go through the list. If you join the club, we'll give you the secret little code to find those places. But there's a lot of people coming, and with a lefty drawing, that's another plus as well. I spoke to I don't know if you all knew Murray over at Hunting Creek Outfitters. So, I talked to him a little bit about, what's going on with COVID and the economy and fly fishing. And he pretty much told me what I've learned from talking to a lot of the fly shop people is business is booming. Early on in the pandemic, you couldn't get any of the stuff, even though there was a little restriction on fly fishing for the first month or so, but we got over that. But the boom, again, we've experienced a 30% growth in our membership. People are really getting into it, which is good. And a lot of young people, a lot of women. It's just been very interesting to see who's getting into it. So we want to hook into them, as we like to say. Move into things. So it's interesting that if you go to the next slide. So when you think about it, Lefty has, I say, cast his line in every continent except for Antarctica. Caught 126 species of fish. He's written 32 books. He's been in countless TV shows and so many other things. But we need to do something for him here in Frederick. So some of the ideas that I had, which I sort of pushed through, and it depends how big or how small we want to get. Trying to get my thing. Okay, so just a couple of the ideas was, designate a trail or path along the river, just a small section. Get a boat ramp. There's 41 miles. You guys probably know the numbers better than me. 41 miles in the Monocacy that are in Frederick County with 10 access points. So maybe one of the boat ramps or something like that could be designated. I like the idea of the plaques or monuments or something, a big rock with a plaque or something like that. Those are options as well. And other than that, we're pretty open. I think hopefully I've told you the importance of this, why it's important to get, some sort of recognition for Lefty, but the value it brings to Frederick and the Frederick area. It's not just the economic value, it's sort of the tie, the bridge from the past to the future. So, Lefty, came up in a different generation, and he's inspired a lot of people to do fly fishing. And a lot of the young people, as this picture here shows, are into it. And we're just trying to get that bridge, and little history doesn't hurt in this thing. So that's sort of all I got. I don't know if you guys have any questions, Tim, or options. How do you want to run this thing? Did I give you enough information? Did you have?
No, that was excellent, Andy. Thank you very much for all that information. Yeah, you and I, as you mentioned, you and I have spoken on the phone about possibilities and stuff. So just a few, and they're kind of on the negative side, but I will tell you that the county parks department does, and the Board of Ed, I believe also, because it's schools and parks, there's a county policy not to name parks and schools after specific people, but that certainly does not preclude or prevent any kind of plaque or marker or trailhead or boat ramp name or something like that, or boat ramp acknowledgement, something. So, and what I discussed with Andy, after ideas are more, or maybe more solidified, or specific proposals that are created, or ideas or movement, perhaps the commission would evaluate a letter of support for whatever action that the fly fishermen or any other group wants to do for commemorating or memorializing Lefty Kreh. We have city parks or county parks. We have state and federal parks in our county. So I think there are a number of options that where some kind of memorial could be placed. And I mean, I personally think it's a wonderful idea. It's world famous. It's honoring our history, some heritage and a, well-known Frederick County native. So I think it's positive, but I'll certainly leave it up to the commission for future discussion, or if Councilmember Donald or Alderman Wilson would like to say anything, please feel free.
I think the idea of having something in town is a good idea since he was actually from Frederick City. It might actually be where more people would see a monument as well. On Bent Street, perhaps, right there where the creek crosses under it would be a great location for.
Well, I was thinking of something on, I think Jerry Donald mentioned in the chat there, something on Carroll Creek would be most appropriate.
Yeah.
We do have well, actually one statue already being established there. I would imagine it would be appropriate to have his statue there too, or some type of, memorial.
I think that's a fabulous idea, because I don't know if you guys have been to Boston, Faneuil Hall Marketplace. If you go around there, outside on one of the benches, there's this statue of Red Auerbach, like with a cigar and all that. That's sort of lifelike and is like the neatest thing, and people flock to that and then take pictures by it. So the idea of doing it in Carroll Creek, I never even dreamed that, but I think that would be fabulous as a tourism thing.
Yeah, I mean, people go on to Carroll Creek, and right now it's just for taking photos, but eventually it will be more activities out there, and I can't think of any other place better than Carroll Creek.
But actually, the upper end of Carroll Creek, just before Route 15, is designated for trout fishing by youth and by people like blind and other handicapped people as well. So I would think a memorial up there would be a very good idea. And it would be less obscure than putting it somewhere along the river, I think.
Or another possibility, there's a active group that has done really phenomenal work, Friends of Waterford Park. That's a park, some of you are familiar with it. It's adjacent to Carroll Creek in the city. They've done a lot of tree plantings and meadow restoration and stream restoration. So that's another possibility to consider, the Waterford Park there.
And you could put a sign up at a boat ramp too, but I like that idea.
Yeah, I mean, and suggesting that it's a good idea. I'm not quite sure what the Potomac Valley Fly Fishing Club is looking for.
I can tell you what my ask is. You ready?
Yeah.
I'm looking for two things. One is I would like you all as a commission to say, decent idea, go explore. And two is I want you to let Tim help me or help us, because it's a collaboration. It's not. Go ahead, Gary.
I got a question for you, Andy.
Go ahead.
This is Gary. Can you tell me a little bit about the Potomac Valley Fly Fishers Club, and if there's a local, does that cover Frederick City and Frederick County, or is there a local group?
No, we're Frederick County, but we have members like all over the place, including Virginia and DC. But the predominant.
Is there more of a local group, Andy?
No, we're the local group. In fact, our home waters is at the Catoctin Nature Center.
I see.
So on Catoctin, in fact, we work with DNR and I think the county. We actually raise trout, I think, at the upper end of Carroll Creek on Montague Road and back of the extension building. We actually have a trout pen that the state gives us little fingerlings, and we have guys go over there once a week, and they feed the fish, and then we release them in November. You have these huge rainbow trout. So yeah, no, we're Frederick County and city based.
Yeah, they're also the international organization as well. I think, right, Andy?
Yep, IFF. Yeah, Charlie, you're a member of ours. You should be. Go ahead. Speak on my behalf, Charlie.
No.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Do you already have funding for what you have in mind, or how would you go about that?
we have no funding because we didn't really have a solid thing. I assume, as always, budgets are problems for government entities, and depending on the cost, I'm willing to, go out to, our membership and other private individuals to see if we can raise some money. I can't imagine. I don't know how much these things cost, but we're going to give it a try. I'm not out here with a hand open for the government.
Yeah, well, my read is that you're trying to seek advocacy for a proper location, and I think that that's a great thing.
I figure this is just the first step in a long voyage.
Mhm.
We fly fishermen are known for our patience. When you figure we're out there waiting in water for 3 or 4 hours, and we release everything we catch and we walk home empty, we know we're getting satisfied by something.
Andy, this is Gary again. I hear it's spiritual. I hope to do this someday, but fly fishing is spiritual. If to recognize Lefty, and I'm in favor of us continuing to explore this. I think Jerry Donald has a number of good ideas in chat, but I must say I would have welcomed the fly fishermen or your group to be a little more vocal during the Monocacy management hearings a couple of years ago.
I would say we actually discussed it, and to be honest, we made a conscious decision to try to not be political. And I'm trying not to be political in this thing. That turned into I wasn't the president, so it's easy for me to make excuses. But we're about fishing. We didn't want to get in the middle of that, to be honest with you. That's all I can say.
I see an advantage of putting it on the river in a place like, say one of the boat ramps, maybe even right there at Park Mills Road, which would be like close to the end of the river. I know I see a lot of fishermen down there, and that way the fishermen would see the sign. If it's in town, or the plaque, if it's in town, it might not be as much of a place where the fishermen would go. I'm not sure how much fly fishing is going on Carroll Creek, but you were mentioning upstream. It's considered a trout stream? That's I didn't know that.
Well, there's a lot of bass there. It's not mainly trout, but I do know that Lefty did most of his fishing out of Sarasville. From what he told me, he said in his book, he used to hike like 4 miles to Sarasville. But we were initially thinking just the fly fishermen. I sort of like the idea of just name a boat ramp after him and have a statue in the Carroll Creek. I like that idea. It's sort of to appeal to both.
Seeing the pictures of the fishermen standing by the signs, makes me think it's a tourist destination. That sort of a thing. I can
that
see
was our
that as being
thought.
a benefit, definitely.
That was our initial thought. Just make it a tourist thing.
So Andy, what's the next step from here? I'm just curious. How does this progress?
If you guys say you're supportive, I would like to follow Tim to see that we can create a little action plan. Because we have ideas, so let's come up with some ideas. We run it by people and see if we can, build support and a coalition to do this kind of thing.
I mean, I don't hear anyone saying we're not supportive of it here. And you have two good ideas, the Carroll Creek and then your boat ramp plaque. Both.
Random question. Where is Sarasville? Are you saying Searsville?
Maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong because I'm from
Okay, it's
Massachusetts.
Searsville. That's okay.
It's my accent.
I was like, where? Sorry about that.
That's all right. I can now pronounce Conococheague, so I feel very fortunate about that. So, took me years.
Well, Andy, this is really good. It's a good discussion, and I'm more than willing and happy to work with you. I don't hear any, like as Charles said, I'm not hearing any objection, and we'll explore what we can here, on the county end with trying to facilitate whatever decisions made for whatever structure or whatever is done. But yeah, so I'm happy to work with you, Andy. if the group is in favor of, expanding, exploring and discussing it further.
Do we need a motion, Tim?
I don't think so. I think there's unanimous support. I don't think, I wouldn't recommend a motion being, well, if you want to like formalize it, we could. Maybe that wouldn't be such a bad idea. Just to get it on the record and in the minutes. So yes, I guess a motion would be good.
I'd make a motion that we support the activity.
Mhm.
Is there a second?
I have a quick question. I'm not sure what the scope of our mission is, or like, I guess being new and have read, our mission, I want to make sure that we're advocating in a way that we can, per se. So perhaps, and I know we're going to discuss this later, but maybe have a separate discussion at some point to understand what we can do and what maybe our limitations of our role would be. I mean, just to be appropriate.
Yeah, we can review those, Lonnie. The charge and mission and duties that were approved by the council in the bill creating the commission, they're quite broad and large and wide, frankly. So I think this is wholly consistent and within the realm of the commission's duties and responsibilities.
Well, then we can commence with the motion that's on the table. So somebody made the first motion. We want to go ahead with that then.
Yeah. Second, Kim, seconded by Kim. Okay.
Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor, say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Motion carries.
All right. Very excited.
I'm sorry,
Thank you all. Thanks for listening.
I'm sorry to jump in again, but because this is a video meeting, we do need to do a voice vote. So can we go through the roster and do a voice vote, please?
Yeah. Okay. Kim,
Aye.
Lonnie,
Aye.
Charles,
Aye.
Glenn. I don't know if Glenn's here. Andy,
Nay.
Peter, Matt,
Aye.
Gary,
Aye.
and Bill.
Aye.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much again, Andy, and we'll be in touch and communication.
Thank you. I look forward to working with all y'all. Best of luck.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, moving on to the next item is our second speaker. Kevin Sellner is here to present an overview and summary of his findings of the analysis of the Monocacy River water quality. So good evening, Kevin. Would you like to say a few introductory words before I start your PowerPoint?
Sure. Go ahead. Bring it up, Tim, and while you're doing that, I'll. I was working at, I'm retired, oceanographer, limnologist now, and I worked with Drew Ferrier over at Hood College, the Center for Coastal and Watershed Studies. And we put this together some two and a half years ago. Gary Magnuson was very important to us in helping us scope out what we wanted to do, and then next steps and getting a little bit of funding for some students to analyze some data, et cetera. The reason for the analysis was because of the Monocacy River Scenic River Plan discussions that you've all alluded to. And so we wanted to have the data that are available actually speak for the river and let the data inform the county council and county executive, and from those data they could then make their decisions. So anyway, with that, so I'm a scientist, and Drew Ferrier is also on the line. So if we start to get too technical, just start waving. We have our own jargon, unfortunately, that sometimes is just, it's common to us, but it may not be understandable to you, so please interrupt. It may be too long, so if that looks like that's going to interrupt the rest of your evenings, then just give me a heads up, maybe 20 minutes in or so, Tim, and I'll go faster or jump to the end, something like that. Okay, so can I have the next slide, Tim? So putting the key findings up now, because in case I have to jump because of time, I just want you to know what we found in this analysis of 33 years of river data that DNR has been collecting monthly since 1986, and we analyzed through 2018. There are two nutrients we looked at, phosphorus and nitrogen, both of them required by all plants in the water, on the ground, in crops, trees, etc. Every single plant out there requires phosphorus and nitrogen. So the key findings are that phosphorus concentrations are highest at the Pennsylvania-Maryland border at the northernmost station, and downriver concentrations decline due to contributions from Big Pipe Creek, which primarily drains from Carroll County. A wastewater treatment plant at the city was installed in roughly 2002-ish timeframe, and that made a tremendous impact on reducing phosphorus concentrations further down the river. Next bullet, Tim. The river nitrogen, on the other hand, in contrast to the phosphorus, it's actually derived from Big Pipe Creek, so primarily from Carroll County, it is essentially, there are smaller increases, and we'll see those data in a little bit as it passes through the county, so that the county is adding nutrient to the loads that are coming in from our Pennsylvania neighbor to the north. Next one, Tim. They've generally declined, all nutrients have generally declined in the time period. Frederick County and city still remain sources of nitrogen, though, as the river passes through city boundaries. I'm sorry, the county and the city boundaries. Next one. The nutrient increases in the county are primarily from agricultural activities. And that's, not unexpected, since agriculture dominates the industry of the county. But the most rapidly increasing source of nutrients in the Monocacy watershed is development. And that's actually true bay-wide in the bay-wide watershed. Next bullet, please. And we did an analysis that allowed us to identify seasonal patterns. In other words, we know when maximum precipitation occurs historically in each season, and then there are deviations from those seasonal patterns that have to do with major storms. And you'll see some of the results from that. And those major storms have some implications for what the city and county might do in the future to address these intermittent loads that are coming in, and that's being addressed in the climate emergency resolutions that the city and county have recently passed. Next slide. Okay, so the basic background is that all rivers transport land-derived nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, and other materials, and we'll get to those other materials in the end. The nitrogen is found as these pools of total nitrogen. That's every single nitrogen containing compound. Dissolved inorganic nitrogen, which is the pool of nitrate, nitrite, and ammonium. And those are the two NO2-3 and the NH4. Those are nitrate, nitrite, and ammonium. So those are basically the 4 to 5 pools that make up nitrogen in the river. Phosphorus is found in only 2 pools. Total phosphorus, meaning all phosphorus that's in particles and dissolved, and then orthophosphate, which is inorganic. That is, it is not in any organic material like plants or animals or anything like that. There is also organic phosphorus and organic nitrogen, but they're lumped into the TN and TP categories. So as I said earlier, nitrogen and phosphorus are critical macronutrients for all planktonic, that's free-floating algae, and benthic algae. Those are algae that inhabit the bottom. And cyanobacteria you might know as blue-green algae. Most people think of it as that scum that forms on the top of farm ponds and Color Lake, etc. And then submersed grasses. So if you go out in the Potomac, and maybe Andy knows this from his fishing, you see lots of submerged grasses kind of flowing with the current. Well, nitrogen and phosphorus supports the growth of all of those. The eventual decomposition of those pools of phytoplankton, the planktonic algae, the benthic algae, the cyanobacteria, and the grasses leads to that bay hypoxia or anoxia, which has driven the bay-wide implementation of the total maximum daily load that's allowed across the watershed. And that's basically telling each community, each county, municipality, how much nitrogen phosphorus sediment that they are allowed to dump or release into the receiving waters that basically then go down and support the growth of those organisms I just mentioned. And when they decompose, it creates the bay hypoxia that is driving these regulatory management requirements that we now face since 2010. In the beginning, there were multiple statements that were made that since the bay is getting better back in a couple of years ago, and that's basically the Bay Foundation and the Bay Program and other organizations were concluding that. Then the conclusion was that we must be doing better too. The county must be doing better. And that if there was any problem, it was obviously coming from our neighbor to the north. It wasn't us because we were very stringent about what we were doing with our loads. So that's why we undertook the study. Next slide, please. So here's a map of the county and the watershed. You can see the upper part is basically in southern Pennsylvania. And then you can see the 5 stations that Maryland DNR has been collecting samples at and analyzing data since 1986 into the present. You're going to see references to, rather than the station designations and numbers and codes, I tried to make it so that you would see it as Pennsylvania border, Carroll County introduction, north of the city, below the city, and then just north of the Potomac. So those are the 5 stations. And we analyzed the data from those 5 stations for that time period. Next slide, please. So I don't want you to get anything from this other than look at the extremely high variability. That's all that you should be looking at here. The river is a function of precipitation events, drought events, snow melts, etc. The concentrations in the boxes at the top give you an indication of the average concentrations of the nutrients over that 33-year period. Don't try to memorize this because I'm going to get into a graph, the easy to understand graph in a couple of slides. But basically you can see the Pennsylvania border basically has a higher level than what's coming in at Big Pipe Creek. And then south of the city, you can see that the numbers jump up again. Next slide, please. Okay, so the way we analyze these data is we plotted all of the data out, and then we set up 2 different models, mathematical models, to tease out patterns that would be in the data. And the teasing, you can see the very high frequency up and down patterns on the one that says season. And that's basically the concentrations of phosphorus that would be occurring in the 4 different seasons. We've removed all of that variability so you can see the bottom line results over on the right side. And the take-home message for this is that the highest concentrations of dissolved phosphorus are found in the summertime. That's the red line. They are slightly lower in the fall, You can see the yellow, barely see the yellow line. And the lowest concentrations are in the spring. So that's the seasonal pattern for dissolved phosphorus in the river over the 33-year period. Can I have the next slide, Tim, or next button? Now you look at this one, and it's a repeat of the slide on the upper left, but we've added in flow. So variabilities in flow will alter that seasonal pattern. And the magenta, or that pink color, you can see the very high peaks, low peaks associated with this graph. And those represent the impacts of extremely high flows, that is big precipitation events and the river increases in volume, or droughts, and that's the lower, the pink that's going below the average concentrations. And so that high variability, much higher than what you see in that pattern in the upper left, that high pink variability indicates that major precipitation events or their absence, such as in droughts, does have a dramatic effect on the river nutrient concentrations, in this case phosphorus. And the implications of that are that with our new climate, the climate that is here and projected through 2100, basically will have much more intense precipitation events. They'll be more frequent than they are now, and then they will be separated by periods of drought. So that high variability in the pink that you see below in that lower panel means that we have to consider various practices that would alleviate, that would reduce that variability. We don't want huge pulses of nutrient going into the river at any time. We're trying to keep those reductions or the loads quite low. Next slide, please. Okay, what happened? Well, here's a result of the station just below the city of Frederick. And you'll note in the oval, there seems to be a rapid decline in the concentration of the dissolved inorganic phosphorus. So about 2002, and for a while, we were asking the various county staff what could be the possible reason for this. Because if you do the pattern that I was saying, if you get an average concentration over this, you actually miss what might have happened to explain this large decline. So we went in and we actually found through some conversations with the city that in fact they had implemented biological nitrogen removal and phosphorus precipitation in about November 2002. And so the result is this rapid decline, large decline in this dissolved inorganic phosphorus. So it has major implications for what the lower part of the river has in terms of this macronutrient that it's exporting into the Potomac River and then further down bay. Next slide, please. Okay, the implications of that decline are pretty evident here. You'll see in this contrast. So looking at the whole data set, the phosphorus that's coming in at the Pennsylvania border is essentially just slightly greater than 0.1 milligrams per liter on average for this 33-year period. And then the water that comes in from Carroll County in Big Pipe Creek is much lower. So when those two creek and river mix, then in fact it's going to lower the concentration because it's not an additive process. You're diluting the higher concentration that's coming in at the Pennsylvania border, and that results in that first blue arrow that's moving from left to right. And so at north of the city, that dilution has occurred from Big Pipe Creek. And you can see that the concentrations by that blue arrow, meaning that they are significantly lower just north of the city. Now, once it passes through the city for the 33-year period, you can see that it jumps up. And then why would that be? Well, if at the time prior to 2002, as I was saying from that jump, there was no removal the removal of phosphorus was not very high. The BNR and the other phosphorus reduction strategy hadn't been implemented. So in fact, the city was adding phosphorus to the river as it passed through. So that arrow that's going up, the second arrow that's going up, indicates that city contribution. Further downriver, it's being diluted by land use practices, etc. So you can see there's a slight significant decline further downriver. But what is entering the Potomac is higher than what came in at the Pennsylvania border. Okay, next click. Okay, now if we analyze, because of that jump or that decline in 2002, we knew we had to analyze the data for that 2002 period on, because you couldn't very well say to the rest of the, to everybody who's interested in the river, well, geez, it looks like there's a major problem that would be evident from the panel on the left. Well, the implementation and construction of that wastewater treatment facility in November 2002 dramatically changed that downriver pattern. You notice that you'll still see the dilution of the phosphorus coming into Pennsylvania border by Big Pipe Creek's water and lower phosphorus concentrations. So just above the city, you can see that it's declined from what's coming at the border, but the construction of that plant with that new capability, rather than having the increase that you see south of the city in the left panel, we actually see that the concentration is much, much lower. And in fact, the equal sign means that there was no statistical difference between any of the average nutrient concentrations for that time period for those three bars. So this wastewater treatment plant upgrades in November of 2002 have dramatic implications for what is being added downstream of the city, and importantly, what's going into the Potomac. Because look at the magnitude of the bar on the extreme right. It's about half or so of what's on the bar on the left-hand panel. So that phosphorus upgrade in 2002 had a dramatic and positive effect on that phosphorus concentration. What that would imply is that for the Potomac and then the receiving waters of the Bay, at least what we were doing in Frederick County after November of 2002 for phosphorus was an improvement over what we had done historically. Okay, next slide. All right, now we're going to jump over to nitrogen. Nitrogen is a reverse of that pattern in a way. Notice that the Pennsylvania border nutrient concentration is on the order of 1.3 milligrams per liter on average for the 33-year period. If you look at the panel next to it, Big Pipe Creek average is 3.2 milligrams per liter. So in contrast to the situation with phosphorus, where Big Pipe Creek diluted what was coming in from the Pennsylvania border, Big Pipe Creek nitrogen is actually enriching what's coming in from the Pennsylvania border. Next slide, please. So here's a repetition of those very busy slides before. Again, these are just to show the seasonal patterns. Again, note the high up and down variability of those of the black line. That's the seasonal pattern of nitrogen concentrations in the river. And then we're removing all of the not the noise, but the variability. You can see that in fact the seasonal pattern is different from what we saw with the phosphorus. Phosphorus was higher in summer and fall. Here, nitrogen is higher in the winter and spring. And in a way, that's what you kind of guess, because nitrogen is dissolved primarily in the dissolved state. And when snow melts, it basically carries that soluble nitrogen down into the river. So you get a big pulse of dissolved nitrogen accompanying the winter thaw and spring runoff from precipitation events. So again, different pattern than what we saw with phosphorus. Next slide, next bump, sorry. Now here you see, again, just like with the phosphorus, the very high variability with the pink, the magenta color, that's associated with extreme weather events. That high variability in nitrogen implies again that in fact we would have to pay close attention to either extreme precipitation events to bring in more nitrogen, or the droughts to in effect reduce the amount of nitrogen that's coming in from the land. The implications for climate are, because again, as I said earlier, because the new climate is going to have these more frequent extreme storms and then separated by larger, longer periods of drought, we must take that into account as we try to manage the loads of nitrogen and phosphorus to the river. Okay, am I too technical here? Is it okay? Is everybody okay with this? Okay, good. I saw one thumbs up. That's good. Next slide, Tim. Okay, so what's the pattern, 33-year pattern for nitrogen? You can see that the Pennsylvania border is fairly low for nitrogen, and that basically is enriched by the addition of nitrogen that comes in from Carroll County's Big Pipe Creek. That results in an increase, a significant increase in the river's nitrogen north of the city. That's that first blue arrow that's moving up from left to right. And then as it passes through the city, there's again an increase, a slight increase that's due to the city's contribution, urbanization, suburbanization, etc. That's adding in nitrogen. Okay, that's for that entire, and then that does not change as it moves downriver to just north of the Potomac. And that's, again, the 33-year period. Let's look at the pattern after the improvements. Okay, so here's the same story again. You can see that, in fact, north of the city, the concentration is increasing for that 2005 to 2018 period. It again increases from north of the city to south of the city, but notice that the height of the bars is lower, so that the amount of nitrogen coming in from urbanization, suburbanization is significantly higher, but only slightly. And then from south of the city to north of the Potomac, where the Monocacy enters the Potomac, there's also just a slight increase in nitrogen. Again, meaning that whatever land practices we have in the county, we are adding nitrogen at levels that are altering the concentrations in the river by a significant amount. Even though it looks like a small number, the amount of nitrogen as it passes through the county is actually increasing due to our land use activities. Okay, next slide. We also measured total suspended solids and chlorophyll. Total suspended solids are interesting because that's what governs the amount of light that comes in and into the water and then passes through the water column. And total suspended solids often includes sediment particles to which phosphorus is bound. Most phosphorus comes into receiving waters bound to sediment particles. Well, there was very little significant change in TSS over the time period, whether 33 years or the shorter 2005 to 2018 period. For chlorophyll, the reason we looked at chlorophyll was if those macronutrients are coming in to the river, was there a river response in terms of the algae and the cyanobacteria that were in the river? And again, there were some slight differences, but nothing that would indicate a major eutrophication problem. So the nutrients were largely passing through the county without actually fueling a lot of production of algae and cyanobacteria. So we weren't loading the Potomac or the Bay with biomass that would break down to cause hypoxia and anoxia. We were loading with nutrients, but not with actual particles of algae. Okay, next slide. Okay, so one of the thoughts was, okay, land use, as I said in the opening slide, because agriculture is our dominant industry, it was likely a major source of nutrients. And again, if development was our major industry, it would be the same for development. But it was brought up like, okay, what about all the wastewater treatment plants? Are they the cause for what we're seeing in the river? Well, my colleagues at the Chesapeake Bay program collected all the data from the major wastewater treatment plants in the county. And basically the take-home message is that the concentrations for the major wastewater treatment plants are quite low and likely do not explain the elevated concentrations that we saw of nitrogen phosphorus in the river. You can note at the extreme right side of these diagrams that in fact the red line is tending down to very low levels. At least in the two panels in the upper row. Can you go to the next slide, Tim? So what we did is from that, we said, okay, wait a minute, let's put the whole picture together. We've got agriculture as a major industry. We've got wastewater treatment plants for the increasing populations within the county. Let's look at the model output of all of those loads and see if it agrees with kind of what we were contemplating for explanations of the nutrients in the river. Well, here what you see is basically the upper river, which is above north of the city, mid-river, which is just above the river, above the city, and then lower is below the city. The size of the pie represents the magnitude of the amount of load of that nutrient coming into the water. So the bigger the circle, the more nutrient coming in. And you can see that in all cases for nitrogen, it's dominated by blue, and that's agriculture. However, if you start summing up regulated development, non-regulated development, wastewater, and septic, they turn out to be an increasingly important piece of that pie because it suggests that, in fact, as we urbanize and suburbanize and we build homes for the new population, that, in fact, that load is going to go up through time. If you move to the phosphorus situation, again, ag is the major source in the upper portion of the watershed. And then the other components, other parts of land use become more dominant and more important in the lower portion of the Monocacy watershed. So all of this gives us kind of an insight of, okay, what do we do in the future to try to ameliorate and reduce these overall loads? Can I have the next slide, Tim? Oh, okay. So when I mentioned in the beginning about other compounds, there are other things in the river that we did not analyze, we don't have data for. Extensive time series data like the 33 years I was mentioning for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediments. But there are things that are coming in from ag and from urban, suburban areas, like herbicides and pesticides. Some of these compounds do cause intersex in fishes. Intersex meaning that a fish can be both male and female. And that does have dramatic impacts on fecundity. The number of those fingerlings that were talked about earlier when we were discussing Lefty. And those compounds can also lead to compromising the fish's ability to deal with stress, whether it be a pathogen like a bacterium, like a fungi that would infect an open wound. So those things are a big concern for, and particularly I would think for fishers, because those things can reduce fecundity of our, particularly our smallmouth bass populations. If you look at the macroinvertebrates, DNR and the county actually go out to these creeks, all the creeks that feed into the Monocacy tributaries, and you scoop up the sediment and you analyze the little animals in that sediment. Those are called macroinvertebrates. In most of these small tributaries in the Monocacy watershed, they are poor to fair, meaning that in fact, the Monocacy problems that we're seeing in terms of elevated nutrients may also be characterized by similar conditions in these small tributaries. So it's not just the Monocacy that's having these problems. It's the small little creeks that are feeding into the larger creeks and rivers that then feed the Monocacy. We also know that Fort Detrick has substantial, over 3-4 decades of burying parts of its contaminated materials on site. And so those things are leaking or volatilizing, and they can go into the receiving waters. And the current focus areas are trichloroethylenes. And these compounds essentially dump into Carroll Creek, which come into the Monocacy. So those are things we have to be concerned about. Drinking water plants produce halogenated. Halogenated means bromine, chlorine, elements are added to various organic matter that come out of drinking water plants. And if those levels get too high in the river, then in fact they can pose human health problems. And they have not caused those problems, so no worries right now, but they are being monitored by the county and city routinely. And then finally, that warmer climate that we're now experiencing, we select for this group called cyanobacteria. And these cyanobacteria can be in the water column, and as I said before, they can be like the scum that you would see floating on the surface of a pond, or they can be on the bottom. And some of them produce toxic compounds that are toxic to wildlife and to our fellow citizens, residents, fishers. And so there is some concern, and we've talked with the Council of Governments and city and county about how they're treating their waters. So far, with the concentrations of these compounds that we're seeing, we're fine. But in the future, as it gets warmer, only this group of organisms will be prevalent in our waterways, which means we'll have to be even more diligent about these toxic compounds that are being produced. So next slide. Okay, hit it again, Tim. All right, this is just a repeat of what I said in the beginning, and I'll just go quickly. So the phosphorus concentrations are diluted by what comes in from Big Pipe Creek. The implementation of that sewage treatment upgrade in Frederick City in 2002 has led to substantial reductions in phosphorus. Next one. River nitrogen is actually increased by what comes in from Big Pipe Creek and Carroll County. It drains Carroll County. And there are reductions that are occurring through the plant, but there are still increases all the way down to the Potomac. They're small, but they're increases. The general pattern is there's a decline through time, and that's very good. But again, it's still that we're increasing as the river passes through the county. Right now, the nutrient loads are primarily from ag. Again, the largest industry, not too surprising. No industry can be 100% perfect in terms of preventing any nutrient inputs. So, if, as I said, if development became your #1 industry, it would have the highest loads. So, and then those pink magenta line, the high variability in those lines suggest that in fact major storms and droughts do have impacts on the river in terms of drastic modifications of those concentrations. So as our new climate comes in with these extreme weather events and separated by these droughts, we have to start thinking of new implementation practices to reduce the threats from those loads. Next slide. Okay, what do we want to do? Well, up in Big Pipe Creek, that drains Carroll County, but it is merges with Little Pipe Creek. And Little Pipe Creek is receiving contributions from Frederick County and also from Carroll County. So when the few data that we have for Little Pipe Creek suggest that, in fact, the nitrogen concentrations in Little Pipe Creek are actually quite high. So could it be that Big Pipe Creek from Carroll County mixing with waters from Little Pipe Creek from both Frederick and Carroll County are resulting in those elevated nitrogen concentrations that are driving up the Monocacy River concentrations north of the city? So we need to go in and look at Little Pipe Creek, and I'll get to this point in a minute. What are the nutrients that are associated with these high variability, these pink peaks? Is it nitrogen that's driven by low flows, high flows? Is it phosphorus that's driven by those? There are models out there that we can use to tease out these contributions, but the models, this mathematical way that you look at water flow and land use loads to that water flow, generally are limited to systems over 100 cubic feet per second. So they're not the smallest streams, and in fact, the smallest streams and rivulets may be major sources that we won't be able to estimate. And forget the next one, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so there is a phase 2 to what we've done. This first effort was a phase 1. And the 3 areas that you see are potential hotspots, either for nitrogen, phosphorus, or both. And so, as I mentioned above, what about Little Pipe Creek? That's that oval red area up in the northern part or northeastern part of the county. Should we be sampling there at the little tribs where they join Little Pipe Creek, and then at Little Pipe Creek where it joins Big Pipe Creek, to find out if we can identify, are there sources and land uses that we can potentially work with the owners of those lands to say, hey, here's some incentive, here's some tax breaks, here's some ways that we could actually reduce the loads from your particular land use activity. And we can do that in summer. Summer base flow means when precipitation events are essentially in those drought periods, most of the load is coming from groundwater. It's not coming from surface water. So that's particularly important because it tells you what that background level of nitrogen, particularly nitrogen, is. Next bullet. So after we would get those data, the idea was then to identify those land uses and where there might be issues with loads that are coming in, nitrogen, phosphorus, sediments, and then look for those unique opportunities, whether they be all public, whether they be public-private partnerships, whether there be some unique financing opportunities that we could do to essentially reduce the loads from those particular land uses. Next one. Finally, the land options that are out there to ease some of these problems are actually on many of the reports and documents that the county and city maintain right now. And it's where we drew upon many of those documents to come up with some of these isolated nutrient concentrations. For example, for Little Pipe Creek, for some of the very small tributaries that are coming in south of the city, etc. The current Climate Emergency Mobilization Work Group, which I co-chair, is undertaking an analysis of these types of systems to find out, okay, are there practices on the land that are actually going to increase the productivity of that land practice, of that land use, that would also reduce the loads that are coming into the system? So that will be one of the goals, and that series of recommendations to the city and county are requested by the end of September or mid-September. And finally, the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin has just worked out a project with Maryland Department of Environment and National Research, NRCS, to study the Little Pipe Creek for just the types of thing I was talking about above. So we may be able to partner with them in terms of understanding where the load sources in Little Pipe Creek and what can we do to change those load patterns in the future. Next one. So with that, I'd like to end it, and I'm sorry if it was too technical. I didn't hear anybody screaming that it was over their heads or anything, so I hope it was okay. And Drew Ferrier, my collaborator, is on the line too. So at any time, whether it be now or in the future, you want input, dialogue, data, etc., we can interact with you easily. We work with Gary Magnuson pretty often, and Gary can be an easy conduit to us if you don't want to come to us directly. So,
Kevin, thank you very, very much for that. It was fascinating, to distill all that data, presenting it very clearly for the commission. Good data and knowledge leads to good decision making. So that's the basis for good decision making. So thank you for enlightening us and summarizing that data. It's very, very, very critical.
So I just want to jump in and thank you as well, Dr. Sellner, and also note that it's 8:30, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. I'm guessing that we could easily spend another hour or two talking about Dr. Sellner's presentation. So I'm wondering if folks want to continue and go a little bit later tonight, or if you prefer that we ask Dr. Sellner to join us at our May meeting once you've had time to think about it, review the presentation, and then we can have some discussion about it.
Or another option, if the board has questions, we could write them down. You can submit them to me and I could convey them to Kevin if that would be easier for the group. Or if you wanted to continue for a while longer, we could do that if the commission would like to do that, to kind of, while everything's fresh in our minds, to continue some dialogue with Kevin. I know there are some questions in the chat, so if there's no objection, maybe we'll just keep Kevin and Drew here and open it up for any questions. Let me just go to the chat first to see the questions. Okay, one question is, are these nitrogen phosphorus levels in the river a threat to public and river health? And some other people have questions too.
Yeah, I think before we get into questions, why don't we agree on how we're going to proceed, and if we're going to continue past 8:30, what time we're going to call it. How, I think we need to establish like how late is too late for folks tonight, and if that's 9:30, 10, you need to let us know. And again, I think there are going to be a lot of questions beyond what we can cover tonight. So Dr. Sellner, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to let us know if you can come back and join us for the May meeting to continue the conversation, we'd appreciate that.
yeah, of course, I haven't checked May 25th relative to my climate emergency mobilization requirements, but sure, if it's open, I'd be glad to do that. So.
And Tim, would you mind just going through the roster and checking with everyone and seeing how they're feeling about tonight and when people feel like it's an appropriate time to end the meeting?
Sure. Would anyone like to speak up? The past, just a little history. The past river board meetings were always 7 to 9. So we can discuss having a 2-hour meeting. From here on out. That's just some history. What we've done in the past. We do have other items on the agenda this evening. I know the discussion of the bylaws will be very lengthy. I don't think we have time to do that. So what I would propose, if there's no objection, maybe have a couple of questions for Kevin, then we can go into Matt's presentation about the draft logo. How does that sound for folks?
Tim, I would ask that again that we go through the roster and see when people need to cut out tonight.
Okay, Kim, when would you like to cut out tonight?
I'm good till like 9:30.
Okay, Lonnie, how about you?
I'm clear till 9:30, 10.
Okay, Charles? I'm sorry, didn't hear you, Charles.
Speak up, Charles.
Just get mute.
9:30 would be okay. I needed to unmute. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Glenn, is Glenn with us anymore? I don't see him. Okay, Andy?
I'm good with 9:30.
Okay, Peter? Could you repeat that, Peter?
Yeah, I say I'm good.
Okay. Matt?
9:30 is fine with me.
Okay, and Gary?
No objection to 9:30. I appreciate Kevin and Drew having this on the agenda tonight. And given its importance, I expect water quality to be on our future agendas.
Absolutely. And finally, Chairman Allen, time constraint for you this evening?
9:30 is great, and thank you to Kevin to be coming back to our May meetings.
Okay. So, so there was that one question in the chat. So would you like to begin with that? I'll repeat it. So are the nitrogen phosphorus levels in the river a threat to public health and river health?
So as far as public health, only if the cyanobacteria were to increase as a function of, say, warmer temperatures, the absolute concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus are not a threat to public health. So that's a given. In terms of the river's health, the chlorophyll levels, meaning how much of that nitrogen and phosphorus that is incorporated into plants like algae and cyanobacteria and submerged grasses, they're actually modest, so they're not very high. But the habitats, based on the macrobenthic data I referred to, of all the little tributaries coming in, suggest that in fact there is something that is not very good in terms of water quality for the invertebrates, the insects, bivalves, etc., that live in the river, and that's fish food. And so whether that's due to nitrogen and phosphorus, don't know. But if the water in a particular trib or creek or coming in essentially sits for a long time, and there could be accumulation of nitrogen and phosphorus in chlorophyll that we're not measuring in these stations, then that can lead to low dissolved oxygen in the bottom, and that could cause the macroinvertebrate poor conditions that I was referring to. So in terms of absolute concentration for public health, no, not a threat. For the indirect impacts on cyanobacteria and future toxin exposure, that's there. But right now, that's not a threat, for current conditions. And for other organisms, there is something in the river that is causing these macroinvertebrate problems and the intersex in fish, but we cannot say it is directly attributable to nitrogen and phosphorus. And Drew, do you want to pick me on that? Anything you want to add to that? Drew, you muted yourself. There you go.
Okay, yeah, I think that you pretty much have that, Kevin. I wanted to mention that at least for some of the local rivers, Vicky Blazier is now narrowing down the possibilities of what might be causing intersex, and she doesn't have it down to a single chemical by any means, but we're gaining knowledge there, and I think that's an important thing to keep a lookout for.
Yep. No, I agree. And to get back to the question, I don't think Vicky Blazer is a USGS scientist who looks at fishes. And I would say almost 100% it will not turn out to be nitrogen and phosphorus. So, Matt.
So what about pharmaceuticals? getting into the waterway through our wastewater treatment systems. Could that have something to do with the intersex in fish? That seems like it would be a likely candidate.
Yes, that is a good possibility. Vicky Blazer is looking at a number of compounds. Some of the herbicides, pesticides, and the pharmaceuticals all induce immunosuppression in fishes and intersex. So she is investigating that, and I don't think for the Monocacy has definitive data yet. She certainly has a lot of data for the Upper Potomac and its tributaries, but nothing for specifically to the Monocacy. Although the data, I heard a presentation a year and a half ago, and they have more samples to analyze. So we'll know more about that in the future. But yes, you're absolutely right. Pharmaceuticals are a concern.
Hey, Dr. Zellner, I have a question related to what tests are created or what tests are used to determine the results associated with agricultural outcomes. So like take, for example, I guess how can you tell between fecal matter in related to farming, or are you measuring agricultural fertilizers, plant matter? I mean, like, what is the actual measure? What pinpoints that to be associated with agriculture?
Yeah, it's predominantly magnitude of the land use and the loads. The Chesapeake Bay program and its partners, which includes Maryland and Pennsylvania and New York State, Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. They've gotten all of the experts together, both scientists and technical advisors, et cetera, from all jurisdictions, NRCS, soil conservation districts, technical experts from actual consulting firms who assist the farming community and urban development, suburban, et cetera. And what they've done is they've gone in and looked at the scientific literature for the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and sediments that essentially can come off of all of those land uses as a function of precipitation or as a function of wind erosion, et cetera, et cetera. So what they do is because you can't, as I showed here, there are only 5 stations in the entire watershed that DNR has monitored. They use those data essentially as ground truth and then compare it to what all those experts I was talking about say would be coming from every one of those land uses. So those data act as kind of baseline data for all the land use practices, whether it be cover crops, corn production, wheat production, whatever it might be for ag, and then they do the same thing for urban, suburban areas, stormwater management, wastewater treatment plants, and they can use those proportions of land uses and the documented amounts of loads that come from those practices globally, and I mean by that the scientific literature, and then they can say, okay, because say the Little Pipe Creek has 85% agriculture, it's likely that those nutrient concentrations up there that are dominated by nitrate, which we know is a byproduct of fertilizer application, groundwater input, et cetera, it's likely to be agriculture. But again, it's correlation work. There are for things such as agriculture, stormwater management, and stormwater practices, as you probably know and the group knows, those are called non-point sources. So there's no pipe you can go measure. Like a wastewater treatment plant, you can measure right as the nutrient comes out of the wastewater treatment plant. So you know what that contribution is. For the non-point sources like agriculture, stormwater, even septic, et cetera, you actually have to do a spectrum of samples along an entire creek, river, et cetera, to document those changes through time. And so you then relate that back to the dominant land uses in the area. Now, there are specific tags which nobody has the money to do, but you can actually go in and look at, this is going to sound too technical, but isotopes of nitrogen and phosphorus and oxygen, and you can figure out from the isotopic distribution within the nitrogen and phosphorus compounds, whether it's coming specifically from wastewater treatment plants or agricultural activities or stormwater. So there are ways to do that, but that has not been done on the Monocacy.
I might mention as well a fairly new technique, and it's not widely used right now in the Bay watershed that I know of, but there is the ability now to do bacterial source tracking using molecular techniques. So basically, the idea there is that the bacteria living in the guts of different species of animals, whether they be cattle or horses or people or waterfowl, they all have genetic characteristics that are different from one another. And when we are able to differentiate those, we can take a water sample and get some idea, at least, of the relative contribution of each of those different sources. But it is a relative contribution unless you know what all of the sources are. You always end up with a segment of your pie graph that says other, and so we're not going to be 100% sure of the sources in every case.
I got a question about the phosphorus. You said it's attached to sediment. Is it attached primarily to the silt and the clay fraction or to all the sediment particles?
Yeah, it's mostly the finer grain particles, the quartz, the larger sand grains, the phosphorus in those, that part of the geology is not as high as certainly the fine grain material. So it's definitely the finer grain material that it binds to.
And those finer grain materials are bypassing the stormwater treatment ponds, I believe.
Yeah, that's a very good point. If you have a flow event that is, a substantial flow event, the fine grain materials will be transported further downstream. So if you have a large enough catchment basin, you can actually allow that flow or slow the velocity down so the particles will settle out. But in most cases, in a high flow event, you take those fine particles and they act like conservative particles and they just keep going with the flow. The sedimentation rate and the settling rate for those fine particles is very low. So they're in suspension a very long time.
Thank you.
I have a question, Kevin. It's a kind of a question and a comment. With our altered climate and the bigger storm events that you mentioned, what I've read a little bit, and there's probably more research going on now, the new like bioretention and the micro treatment trains for land development, they will get easily overwhelmed with huge flows. So, trying to mimic like the pre-development hydrology and having all these treatments and devices all over a development site to infiltrate the stormwater and let it, not so it doesn't run off as much into the streams. That's something that we need to look at for our future climate.
Yes, absolutely. The storage capacity for, well, what you just said, stormwater, but as well for our sewage treatment plants has to increase because those major events, or we have to be prepared to deal with, transport of nutrients, pathogens, pathogenic bacteria, E. coli, others, cryptosporidium. We have to be ready to deal with them after major events. So the storage capacity issue is a one that's kind of looming there, Tim. And land is so valuable that I don't know how we're going to set aside and be able to afford this type of storage capacity that we would need to accommodate those largest events. So that's a worry.
I've got one question about mineral extraction. That's one thing I haven't heard mentioned at all here. And I know that over there in the part of the county that Little Pipe Creek is coming from, there's copper, there's all sorts of other minerals that are in there. And I'm wondering if that could be a source of the nitrogen as well.
There are data. We don't have it for that particular area, Matt, but we do know from the literature that in fact quarries, cement manufacturing companies, they do have a significant potential to add nitrogen and phosphorus into the receiving waters. And of course, if any land use that essentially is manipulating the soils in any way can result in the release of any of those, whether it be metals or minerals. If you go to a site where essentially it gets anoxic, so that smell of hydrogen sulfide, rotten eggs, those types of sites can actually be mobilizing metals if the pH gets low enough. And so, if you essentially get the pH too low under just natural conditions, you can start eluting out some of those potential elements that can cause toxic issues for fish or wildlife and us. So Drew may have more on that than I do. So.
Thanks.
I don't have a comment on that exactly, Kevin, but I did want to bring up something that I've been reading recently and I think is quite interesting, and I think it's quite forward-thinking actually, and that is that slowing down these sediments higher in the watershed and retaining some of this water higher in the watershed is potentially very, very important. And we're missing, I think, a good opportunity by not considering beaver management. Beavers and beaver dams are great at doing these exact things, and they also help us to restore highly incised streams. Several states are taking the lead on this and having quite good success with controlled beaver developments along streams in the right places. And I think that's something that would be very helpful to the watershed, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. There's a woman named, Drew and I work with a woman named Grace Brush, who's been at Johns Hopkins for, geez, I think she's older than I am, so a long time. Anyway, Grace, that very issue, that back in, when the colonial period and there was the early settlers going on, beavers had so many dams everywhere that it essentially pooled water. And the pooled water allows for bacteria to actually take that nitrogen and convert it into nitrogen gas. And nitrogen gas is inert. It does not cause any trouble. It's not a greenhouse gas. It's, and it can be taken up by some cyanobacteria, but it's, the amount of denitrification, that release of nitrogen gas, actually would prevent any accumulation of nitrate, which would lead to algal blooms, etc. So it's great. Yeah, the beavers, I think the beaver idea is a great idea. Whether or not, the community would go and get into it, I don't know. I know at the research park over in the city, off of Monocacy Boulevard, a beaver harvest has been going on all winter, and can't find where the beaver dam is, but it's going to cause for good nutrient management over there. So,
just tagging on to what Drew was saying, this is kind of like the non-natural aspect of it. The governments should, I think, examine policies and regulations about development in headwater stream areas. That's a whole other, these up, higher in the watershed areas that have all these small drainage and small rivulets and all these ephemeral and intermittent streams. That's where, land use planning and regulation can help in this whole process about reducing sediment loads and nutrient loads too.
Yeah, I think if Jerry was still on, the county council passed that new regulation, 6 months ago, about making sure that in fact those ephemeral, intermittent, and perennial streams are actually accounted for early in the permitting process so that ideally we won't be allowing those streams to be sacrificed. So that's a great first step, I think, for the county.
Yeah, it is. It was a bill passed to, at the rezoning stage, to more critically evaluate and examine all the resources that exist on a site to just to identify them, and then you can plan for their protection and development that won't impact them so much.
Right. And as Drew said, was referring to, if you slow down water at the headwaters, then you sediment all that material, you create the wetlands that are actually what the beavers are doing too. And then you remove the nitrogen that would be there by that denitrification to nitrogen gas. And so there's no export down to the river. So it's a great way to move forward. All right, I think Drew and I have battled you or hurt your ears long enough.
No, this is really great, Kevin and Drew. Thank you so much for speaking to us and making this presentation. So if there are follow-up questions, I'll take them and I'll certainly pass them along to you, Kevin and Drew.
Okay, sounds great. And good luck to you, SMC members. You know, you got a river to protect and the surrounding land to protect. So good luck.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye now.
Goodbye. Okay, so we do have 2 items left on the agenda, and the consensus was to go to about 9:30. We'll try to shoot for that if we get done. Well, I don't think we'll get done, frankly, the full review of the bylaws, because there's a lot of stuff there to review, and I have a few points to make during that discussion. So let's start first with Matt's proposal for the logo. Let's start that way.
Okay, I can probably do this, relatively quick. The thing